There's no way. You can't fight Washington. You can't change Washington. Those are great ideas, but, well, candidly, think back to when Don and I were sitting here and talking about open government, or when I presented the roadmap to recovery and laid out that balanced budget plan. Did some of you kind of sit back and say, there's no way that this is going to work? It's nice, good concept, but not workable, not politically doable, too much opposition. Honestly. Well, don't believe the hype. We did it here in San Diego. I believe we can make change happen in Washington. And it's one of the most important factors that led me not to seek the mayor's race a second time around. The biggest challenge there being that Bob Filner had pushed through a 5-year labor contract just a month before he resigned. Some of you who know about labor law and some of the issues that I discussed from this podium in previous sessions is that 85% of our budget is decided by the negotiations on the labor contracts. We have 6 labor unions. 85% of the budget, therefore, for the next 5 years is on autopilot. As mayor, if I wanted to go in and say, let's change how this department works, let's change and go to a pay-for-performance system because I want to reward good performers and spend the same money but make sure the higher performers get more, I would have to ask the labor unions permission to even talk about that with them, to reopen the contract, let alone reach agreement. And so it's a stifling environment, and I felt that we could take some of the ideas that we succeeded with here locally to balance the budget, to start restoring services, to save a city on the brink of bankruptcy, take those ideas to Washington, and how would they impact the current situation that we see, the mess? Well, last night, the two parties failed to reach agreement. It's a complete mess in Washington. And it's the best example, the latest example, of the dysfunction in Washington caused by the partisan politics that we see. Neither side is exercising responsible leadership, plain and simple. And so yesterday I laid out an alternative to a government shutdown. It's a 3-part package that they have to accept in its entirety. Part 1, a 1-week clean continuing resolution to give a week of time for negotiations while you fully fund the government during that week. Properly fund. No shutdown has to occur. Buys you time. Now, we shouldn't have had to have gotten to that point, but providing 1 week, it is then contingent upon the second factor of the package. Mandatory, full-scale negotiations by the House and Senate leadership from both parties. So McConnell, Reid, Boehner, and Pelosi. Mandatory, in that room, all 4 of you. Up to this point, there had been no negotiations. Each side would just pass a bill, grandstand, and throw the potato to the other chamber. You're not going to work through anything unless you sit down and talk face to face. Now, you notice I did not include the president in that mix. Notice I did not include the president in that mix. It doesn't seem as though the White House is providing very much leadership when it comes to this issue. But Congress has an obligation, has a constitutional obligation to come up with a budget and to pass appropriation bills. The president can decide whether or not he wants to sign them or not. But right now, the biggest breakdown is the failure to negotiate, the failure to communicate in the Congress to get both sides, both chambers, in agreement on some sort of temporary package while we work through some of these issues. Third, and most important, accountability, a penalty. These members of Congress have failed. In business, they'd be fired. And maybe a lot of them will be fired next November, November 4th, 2014. But in the meantime, they should forfeit their pay. And it's part of a package that I laid out called Fix Congress First. Now, people in Washington know that this is a very popular idea. No budget, no pay. So they passed something that looks like no budget, no pay, but it's really what I call window dressing. What they said is, if we don't pass a resolution within our respective chambers for a budget by April 15th, then we lose pay, temporarily. Once we pass that budget, then we get all of our pay back. No, it doesn't work that way. A real budget means that both the House and the Senate agree to the appropriation bills. That you actually have the authority to fund each department. And that means that these continuing resolutions should not be the way you operate a government. We should actually have a budget, and you should have appropriation bills that implement the budget in every department. In the city of San Diego, we had a requirement that we had to get our budget done by mid-June. Because in July, the appropriation bills would be written line by line, word for word, to implement that budget. And in fact, what you found is that we have in our charter a requirement that we can't attach anything extra to the appropriation bill when it goes through, which is a common sense idea. You know, you're talking about a budget. Your appropriation bill simply takes that budget and translates it into what each program gets to spend line by line. It works in business, it works in the nonprofit sector, but in government, they decide to use these basic processes to grandstand, to create a partisan divide. So our no budget, no pay element of this 3-point plan says that for every day that this week passes, you've lost your salary. And it will not be given back to you. You won't get refunded this. It's not that you're going to get paid late. No, you didn't do your job. And so no budget, no pay. Members of Congress, you've lost your salary because we're on a continuing resolution. And for every day thereafter that we don't have appropriation bills, you lose your salary. Now, ideally, this would condition them so that by the time next year's budget rolls around, and the budget under the U.S. Constitution and our current budgeting laws, the current federal law says the House and the Senate shall pass a budget by April 15th, coincidentally the same day that you pay your taxes. By April 15th, you shall pass your budget. And so if you want to foster agreement and avoid a government shutdown, because the appropriation bills are to be done by September 30th, you have a long ways between that budget on April 15th and the appropriation bills, then I actually think that next year's no budget, no pay provision should begin April 15th. Now, can you imagine how quickly these members of Congress would run to figure out how to work out their differences? And I'm not saying whether it's a Democrat or all you all lose your pay because you didn't come to an agreement. And the pain would be inflicted, the penalty would be imposed, the accountability would be achieved for both Democrats and Republicans in Washington. That they have to find a way to work out their differences and fund properly the budget. Come up with a budget each year like the rest of us have to live under. And so that's what I laid out yesterday. About 90 minutes after I laid that out, to his credit, John Boehner took to the floor and said that he was inviting bipartisan negotiations. Senator Reid, at 1 o'clock in the morning, rejected that offer. So there's still this stalemate. But can you imagine, still, in Washington, the mess is so bad, the partisan politics are so great, that neither side has bothered to sit down at the same table to lay out ideas on how to resolve their differences. Part of the other reforms in the Fix Congress First proposal deal with some of the things that Donna Fry and I talked about here in one of our presentations. Congress passes laws and exempts itself from the law. There are a lot of laws out there. In fact, one of the best examples is Bob Filner. When Bob Filner got in trouble, he said that taxpayers are on the hook, should be on the hook, to pay for his legal fees and all the damages that he's caused because he did not receive sexual harassment training. And he pointed out that he had never received sexual harassment training during his entire career. Now, this is a 70-year-old man. You don't need training to avoid the behavior that you engaged in. But, you know, the interesting thing is that Bob Filner, when he was in his first few terms of Congress, voted for a law, a very common sense law, that requires that every federal manager of the federal government shall undergo sexual harassment training. And we have a similar law here in the state of California that every elected official and manager shall undergo, every 2 years, sexual harassment training. We take it online, we get a certificate, have to pass a test. It's very simple. But the law that Bob Filner voted for, and all these other members of Congress from both parties, had a line in it that said every federal manager, comma, except members of Congress and their staff. And if you take a look at law after law after law, members of Congress exempt or give themselves a special status, special than any of us. Obamacare, for example, they get a massive subsidy under the implementation of Obamacare. That's completely wrong. If it's good enough for the rest of us, you should pay whatever is charged to any rank and file American citizen. Another thing that they exempt themselves from is Open Records Act requests. Under the federal government, there's something called FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. It means that you and I, or a member of the media, can go to any federal agency and say, we want to see documentation, all documentation on the Keystone Pipeline. We want to see all documentation that you might have on the San Onofre nuclear plant. Whatever the question is, give us all the public records. Except, you may not submit a request to the Congress for any congressional documentation. Now, in the state of California, the Brown Act requires, the Public Records Act requires, that even members of the legislature have to respond to public records requests. My office would receive them routinely, and they would ask for everything from my own personal water bill to my correspondence on a particular topic. And we searched and provided whatever compliant documents we needed to provide. And it's the right thing to do. The taxpayer has a right to know, how did you come up with that decision? Who did you talk to? Open government. We don't have any open government in Congress. How about this one? Read the bill. How many times do we hear of a 1,000-page bill that's worked out in the back room in Congress that comes out and even the members of Congress say they've not read the bill? Well, I would require, as part of this Fix Congress First proposal, that any legislation voted on has to be publicly noticed and placed online 72 hours before a vote in its entirety. Any amendments that you're going to consider, put that online as well, so we know what might happen 72 hours ahead. We have this same requirement right now at City Hall and in the legislature, 72-hour requirements, public records. Now, that may not mean that members of Congress actually read legislation, but at least the 72 hours would allow us to read the legislation and weigh in and alert the public as to what's in the legislation. Other provisions in the Fix Congress First, that members of Congress should not receive gifts or free travel sponsored by outside lobbying organizations. Again, we raised this issue in the mayor's race against Bob Filner for taking trips to Paris, and lightning struck again. Came up in his tenure as mayor. But during the month of August, just as an example, members of Congress from both parties took $1.8 million in free travel to places all around the world. Now, there are some trips that are legitimate. There are some trips that you go to Syria, you go to the Middle East, and you're doing fact-finding. You want to figure out what's going on, and does the United States have a national interest here? You know, what's our foreign policy position? Is it the right position? If so, go to the Committee of Jurisdiction and receive approval for members to take that trip. Can you imagine if you start making these trips subject to approval and votes? Members of Congress would have to say, yeah, I voted to send a couple of my colleagues on a nonprofit free trip. Give them authorization to accept that free travel, because here's what's happening in that part of the world, and this is why it is the appropriate thing to do. But you have members of Congress going on junkets with family members all around the world and having this paid for free. Finally, pensions. You have several members of Congress that are double dipping, getting multiple pensions simultaneously. Let's put members of Congress in the same system benchmarked to what the average American receives. Social Security and a 401k. I bet you any money they'd be much more interested in ensuring the long-term solvency of Social Security if they knew that that is the primary vehicle of their retirement for each member of Congress. So these are just common sense ideas, and I don't think that they have a Democrat or Republican label on them. I just think that these are things that the American people expect, that members of Congress should be treated no differently. They should not be exempted from laws that they passed that they expect others to comply with. When it comes to the budget, we should have an accountability provision, because right now the government is shut. And you can blame one side or the other. I'm not interested in who you personally want to blame. The reality is it's a mess. It is a mess, and no one is being held accountable. And these members of Congress would be held accountable if we implement the proposal that I've laid out today. With that, I'll entertain any questions you might have. I know some of you might be thinking, there's no way your colleagues in Washington are going to go for that. Well, I know in the first round they're not going to go for it. But as we showed here in San Diego, when you educate the public, when you take public pressure and apply it to even change-resistant organizations like legislatures, every single one of our ideas that we implemented on a bipartisan vote at the City Council required public pressure. And many of those ideas were rejected first by the City Council. Rejected. They said, no, we don't want to implement this idea. And we lost a lot of votes before we won a lot of votes. With that, I'll entertain any questions. Yes?
If you were...
I've got a tracker here from my opponent's campaign. I'll let you guys, members of the club, ask questions. Go ahead.
Carl, who are you going to back to be the new mayor?
The question is, who am I going to back for the new mayor? I've endorsed Kevin Faulkner, and here's why. Kevin has been part of our reform coalition for many years. He helped me when we took on the sales tax. He helped me when we tried qualifying the pension reform initiative and got that qualified and passed it. He helped me when we cut the red tape on small businesses in San Diego. On each of the reforms that we've implemented, Kevin's been a good partner. He understands the city, and I believe that he brings a temperament to the table where he can work with all sides. Yes, go ahead.
Recently, $300 million was given to Detroit to help with their situation. Of course, we have stock in our own state. How do you feel about what the role of the federal government and state government should be in bailing out cities?
The question is, Detroit just got this big bailout, and what's the role of the federal government in bailing out cities? You want to invite Detroit onto the vessel known as the federal government? That ship is sinking. So you can't keep bailing out entities that need to be bailed out themselves. I think the most important thing that we can do is pass common sense legislation that helps state and local governments implement reforms. Perfect example, pension reform. In our pension reform proposal here locally, there's a provision that says that city employees, if they're currently in the pension system, should be allowed to, on their own accord voluntarily, to opt out of the pension system and go into a 401k. Now, currently, federal law does not allow them to do that. Once you're in, you're stuck. Now, you might say, well, why would a city employee want to get out of the pension system? That's a pretty sweet system. Well, under our law, we also require full and equal contribution, so it's costing them more. So many employees might say, well, wait, I can opt out, keep the benefits that I have at this point, cut them off at this point, but I also then can move into a more affordable plan, a 401k, on a go-forward basis. IRS, Internal Revenue Code language, prevents us from being able to give an employee that option to opt out. Orange County, California has a very similar pension reform provision to the one I just described, and they would like to get IRS approval to opt out. So I proposed legislation as part of my pension reform package for the federal government that would allow states and localities the flexibility to let employees opt out on a one-way direction from defined benefit pension plans into defined contribution pension plans. That provides them flexibility to do the right thing. Right now, the federal government is blocking that flexibility. But I think the federal government, again, another example, when you take a look at what the federal government did to Governor Brown's modest pension reform proposal, he said that in order for the state of California to receive transit funding for state and local transit programs, that they had to undo certain parts of the governor's pension reform that he got into place last year. And I don't think the government went far enough. I think we need to do more. But can you imagine the federal government trying to undo even the baby steps that we were able to achieve on pension reform? So right now, the biggest challenge facing state and local government continues to be unsustainable retirement benefits, the skyrocketing costs of retirement benefits. I think we can provide a lot of remedy through the bill that I just described, the pension reform initiative.
With the Congress's approval rating of about 15%, you coming in...
You wonder what those 15% are doing. I mean, they're probably not paying attention as a result. It should be 0%.
And if I could vote for you, I probably would. But when you're elected next year, what are you going to do as a junior congressperson coming into Congress and trying to make a change to this mess that we have in Washington?
That's a question that I was asked a lot at the door when I walked door to door as a government watchdog wanting to get elected to the city council. People said two things. Number one, I just hope you don't go down there and get sucked into the system and change. Well, you guys probably have seen I've rocked the boat a couple times. Proud of it. We got a lot of change done because we stuck to our guns. So the first and foremost thing is we need to hope that members are